Now, how do we dig deeper, okay, when we're having difficulty influencing each other in the face of contentious issues? Disparities exist in most relationships, though minor ones are rarely a barrier to talking honestly and coming to an effective solution. However, a significant difference in influence often results in a dysfunctional cycle. Now, if we take a look at this particular diagram, you can see how a highly or a high influence person has that strange disparity versus a low influence person. A high influence person resists being influenced, believes that they're always right, devalues or dismisses what the other has to say, and usually becomes the dominant player in the discussion. Whereas the low influence person becomes passive, sometimes withdraws from the situation, resists being influenced as well, okay, mainly as a form of defense or retaliation, and withholds important information that might even be beneficial for the relationship. Now, this dynamic, unfortunately, sets up a self fulfilling prophecy. Why should a high person of influence listen to a low influence person? If the high influence person sees the low influence person as having little to offer, since people resist being put in a dependent position, which the lower power person is in, they tend to withdraw. They don't cooperate. And when they do, they contribute less, thereby reinforcing the perception that they have little to add. Now, it's important that we should know how to communicate and problem solve. And this ability to process how we communicate and problem solve, okay, is one of the most crucial competencies in building deep relationships. It can help resolve specific issues at hand and make future problem solving much easier. Now, differences in influence occur at work, in sibling relationships, in friendships, and of course in marriages. Just because two people are trapped in a dysfunctional cycle doesn't mean that they're doomed forever to stay there. And as challenging as it might be for the lower influence person to take the initiative, it is still possible. And one way to understand how we can break the negative cycle is we try to understand ways on how one gives away influence. For example, assuming that your needs are secondary to the others. You have your own needs, okay? And you have to acknowledge that they are needs, okay? And you shouldn't be devalued for those needs. Another way is not listening to your own feelings, okay? And we've grown in a world wherein rationality is the coin of the realm. Well, as human beings, we also have feelings. And not listening to them is one way of how we can actually uh, remove our leverage in trying to influence the other person. Another way is letting yourself be interrupted. You always let the other person talk, but sometimes, while it would seem polite that we don't want to interrupt, okay, you also have to understand how to communicate, and communication is also give and take. Backing down when someone disagrees with you. Okay, and well, disagreements happen all the time. It could be because there are different perspectives. That's okay. Avoiding conflict is another way we give away influence. Without having that discussion, there is no way that you can actually influence the other person. Okay, not disagreeing with the other, keeping things nice. Everything is nice and breezy. Not giving feedback, assuming that the problem is probably yours. Okay, but in some circumstances, it might make sense that you own up to certain issues as long as you're objectively correct about it, that it is really your fault, you take accountability. But if you've noticed that the other party needs to be corrected and be given feedback, then go ahead, give that feedback. Another way to give away influence is being concerned about being liked or approved. Sometimes we're concerned about our own image and seeing that as a very important thing. Another way would be minimizing the importance of your own comments. You belittle yourself. Well, the mere fact that you're a human being, you are important in yourself. not taking credit for your accomplishments, okay, especially if they're really factual and it can be properly established that it is your accomplishment. And lastly, not pointing out a problem unless you have a solution. So these are the ways on how we give away influence. And any of these beliefs or actions can make it hard for the lower power person to raise difficult issues and stick with it. However, the single most limiting one is fear of conflict. Believing that conflict is a sign of a flawed relationship and or that once conflict is unleashed, disagreements will escalate, it would spiral down and permanently damage the relationship. Now, some of these beliefs come from our upbringings and experience and are especially fraught for people who've been marginalized, who've been excluded from the mainstream because of some differences or differentials in powers in society. While we are all impacted by the circumstances under which we were raised and perhaps the demographic groups we belong to, we have choices regarding the extent to which we allow ourselves to be controlled by them. Again, it's always this adage wherein it's not a problem to have feelings, but once we start to react to those feelings, that is the main issue. Now, even though arguments, debates, discussions, okay, they're not really pleasant. Unless you're the type who really loves to fight and argue, nobody really wants to have an argument. And even though it can escalate to levels that are really dangerous for the relationship, the other side of the spectrum is even worse. Sweeping problems under the rug can be just as perilous. Not only do the issues rarely go away, remember, sweeping them under the rug doesn't really solve anything. Okay, they're still there, but it also risks of those problems festering and growing. Now, these discussions can be damaging if handled poorly. I agree. Sometimes we don't like to go into these discussions because we probably don't know how to go about in those discussions. And perhaps from our own experience in the past, we may have failed. We've had discussions that have really spiraled down and making the relationship even worse. But on the other hand, we have to understand that the solution isn't to avoid these discussions. You need an important set of competencies to productively raise and resolve disagreements.